because we've been at this for 20 years. It isn't as if we didn't know that we wanted people to connect in different ways, whether those were students or the adults working with those students. But as you pointed out, it hasn't become pervasive. And what's the reason why? I think it's all got to do with implementation and change and what will happen. Now, on a more positive note, I was working last week in Alberta. We asked a school district to come in and describe what they were doing. They had zero idea about this project, and they were just talking about how they were helping their system. I think I lost a slide. But the first slide talks about you got to be really clear about what teaching and learning looks like, and you've got to agree on it. And then you've got to build a collaborative culture that replaces compliance orientation. So that's what they're all about at this was in Calgary. And then develop and implement coherent, system-wide strategies that support the kind of teaching and learning that we want to see. So it's 3 simple steps. Be clear about what you want. Use the kind of collaborative support structures that will help people move in that direction. And make sure that they have the tools and strategies to help them do what needs doing. It needs to be powerful, but it needs to be simple if we're going to be able to diffuse. And I cannot do justice to this, but and I don't know if they based this on a commercial product or they created it in-house, but they seem to be using a couple of tools that are really quite helpful at what we were seeing as the wish in that first video. So this one is a tool that I believe the teachers use to communicate with students. And I can't explain it in any great detail, although I listened carefully, but it sounded really exciting. And it was all animated, and it was actually working on their system as they were describing it. And different ways in which students can post. So all of these things do exist and are being used, but once again, in pockets. And this was another example of a workspace where groups can come together and be doing their kinds of sharing. So it is happening. And this is an example of a cluster or a district. Calgary would be, I think, 130,000? 130,000 students. So it's a big entity, and they've said, it's not a whole country, but it's a cluster of its own. Here's how we're going to proceed. So to do that, we need some tools, and we need a way to work together. So as organizers for the early part of our initiative, we sat down and thought, what is something that's simple but powerful that we could use as a tool or a process that will help connect all 10 clusters and is something that is actually so simple that everyone can use it regardless of context. So it's not restrictive or prescriptive. Boy, I think it was that Cosmo. But it gives us some parameters, because if we just say, go forth, all 10 of you, and do something, I don't think we'll be able to share the results quite as well. So what we've done is taken the whole notion of collaborative inquiry and created our own hybrid model. It's been around for a long time. It's 4 simple steps, something like what you saw Calgary describing as what they were doing. So this is going to be sort of the touchstone, we hope, for the way we approach. And I'm going to just now pull these 4 steps out in a sequential manner, but they do loop. The reason we think this is helpful, you could imagine that these 4 steps can have 3 layers of implementation. So we can use that, assess, design, implement, reflect, when we're thinking about our country cluster. So I asked you a couple of questions yesterday. Where are we? What do we think we should be doing? How will we make sure that we implement that with the right kinds of supports and structures to make it happen? How will we be checking our progress? And as a partnership, we will be providing some tools, some resources, some supports at each one of those levels. So there will be a system strand. But the same cycle is just as useful at a district a cluster, a school level. Today we're going to focus in on the teacher inside the school level of how do we use these 4 steps collaboratively. And I think that may be the biggest difference. I think for the last 20 years in some places we've had a lot of collaboration amongst teachers in their planning and delivery, but not nearly so much as we know is more powerful to do. So we are going to take a look at each of these stages of the process. At the assessment stage, teachers need to be sitting, I believe, in collaborative learning groups. It may be virtual, it may be face-to-face. First, they need to learn how to interact with one another in a way that is professional, and that takes some skills. So we'll talk about that. But the idea is that they're looking at the information, the data they have on students. What are their aspirations? What are their interests? And there's lots of ways they may have gathered that. How do we know how our students are achieving currently on whatever skill sets are appropriate that we have to investigate? So a way of gathering all that information. What will we add to what's already happening from this partnership? Well, we're going to have a deep learning competencies framework that we've talked about, the grid, that will help teachers look at, if I want my students to move in their level of collaboration, that will give me some indicators of what collaboration is and what it might look like at different stages of growth. And that will help inform, as I look at my students, where they are, where we want to move. Also, we will have surveys, profiles, and student achievement data. Some of them we will, as a partnership, be providing for you, but there are many others that will be very helpful to you as well, and as people are learning from one another. And then setting those learning goals for the deep learning task. If you think of the video of the 2 little boys, they knew exactly what their task was. They knew what the success criteria for that task was, and they were able to be independent learners in carrying that out. So it will be a combination, but it's just that first phase. The second phase is we take all that information, including our state or curriculum standards, because we can't pretend those things do not exist. And from that, we want to design the learning. That's when one has to investigate a lot of models or strategies. We've seen some in some of the videos that we've looked at. Sometimes people are looking at inquiry, they're looking at project-based. There are many different ways that we can construct solid learning experiences. But what we're hoping to see happening here is that we will utilize at the beginning these deep learning task rubrics as a way to commonly, across all the clusters, have us start thinking about that deep learning competencies framework. So it's an anchor for our thinking, and I will let Max in just a few minutes walk you through how we do that in a really good way. At this stage, it is collaborative. It's not something we want people just, they go home and they do it at night, all by themselves. But there are many ways we could help them collaborate. It doesn't always have to be face-to-face. The third stage of the process is once we have a really good, rich design that's going to engage kids in really thinking at those higher levels, we need to give them all the opportunities to implement that learning. Teachers needing to be that guide, that activator, asking those right questions at the right time. And that will be a skill set that they need to probably expand in terms of how well they use that formative assessment and that just-in-time learning. The final stage of this ongoing process is, of course, coming back, measuring, reflecting, and changing. So once again, this deep learning task rubric can be reviewed and looked at in terms of here's what we were hoping it would accomplish. let's look at what our students did. And once again, a big difference is doing that collaboratively. I think teachers run through this cycle 1,000 times a day, but it's when you put in the other voice and you add the voice of the students, I think that's when we're going to get some real power out of it, because it pushes the edges. We challenge one another. We ask better questions. We get better learning designs. So that's just the flow of what we're going to work on over the next little bit. I'm wanting to just take a quick pause here. If you would turn to each other. How familiar is this collaborative learning cycle? Does it seem to make some sense that we would have a common anchor for our work across the clusters?